China wants to make itself the world's leading economic and military superpower by 2049. But there's a big problem. It's trapped by its own geography. It sits behind a series of island nations hostile to its foreign policy ambitions. These islands potentially serve as staging points to cut off its commerce and send any military force back to the Chinese coastline. Because of its geopolitical vulnerability, China has invested heavily in its missile force and naval buildup. It's expanded its naval fleet, which now includes 3 aircraft carriers, with a 4th on the way. China has not yet attempted to break its containment within the first island chain, but it has flexed its new naval muscle to militarize and fortify the sea lanes within it. China's increased militarization of the area has prompted the United States to respond with freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, to challenge its territorial claims and prevent its military from achieving local supremacy. But what if one of these FONOPs went horribly wrong and a naval battle erupted in the South China Sea? In that case, you would need to ask one question. What would an attempt by the US Navy to sink a Chinese aircraft carrier look like? Here's a scenario. Suppose it's the winter of 2025. Tensions continue to boil in the South China Sea as Chinese ships interfere with Filipino vessels in the Philippines' internationally recognized exclusive economic zone under the terms of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. Collisions between Chinese and Filipino vessels have become increasingly common over the last year as the former attempts to bully the latter out of the waters. It may start innocently enough. A Filipino fishing boat is coming close to the Scarborough Shoal. Under UNCLOS, this area is part of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, but China seized the shoal in 2012 and has controlled it ever since. Chinese ships have rammed Filipino boats trying to enter the shoal's lagoon before, but this time they are particularly aggressive. 2 Chinese Coast Guard ships sink the Filipino fishing boat, prompting a response from the Philippines Navy. In response to the incident, the People's Liberation Army Navy steps up its patrols in areas Manila disputes with Beijing. The Philippines have a mutual defense treaty with the United States and hosts several American military bases. To show its resolve in protecting its ally, the US Navy responds with a FONOPS that will skirt the highly disputed Spratly Islands. One of the Navy's Arleigh Burke-class destroyers will take the lead in the exercise. As expected, the PLAN shadows the American destroyer, which comes within 10 miles of China's artificial islands. 2 Type 054A frigates, on alert from the earlier tension with the Philippines, attempt to block the Navy's ship, and this time, a collision cannot be avoided. Both countries point fingers at the other. China claims that the United States has violated its territorial integrity, while Washington says Beijing was violating international maritime law. With the increasing hostility in the area, China sends one of its aircraft carriers with its accompanying battle group to the area, but Beijing wasn't the only one with such ideas. The United States sends one of its carrier groups to the area too. Submarines from both sides are also present beneath the waves. The increasing militarization of this confined area makes further accidents a lot likelier, and one soon comes. Under international maritime law, military vessels cannot engage in reconnaissance, jam signals, or use weapons. Doing so means they will lose their innocent passage status. Since the US Navy is there to uphold international law and does not want to get into a broader confrontation, it respects these prohibitions, even if doing so will make it vulnerable. China does not want a confrontation either, but it has a different objective. It wants to undermine international law and strengthen its grip on the South China Sea by bullying others out of the area it claims under the 9-dash line. The Chinese carrier attempts to project power by launching a patrol of J-15 Flying Sharks. Despite this show of force, the US Navy remains vigilant. The fortified islands also launch aircraft in support, but the advanced radar and early warning systems of the American carrier group easily track these moves. While the Chinese aircraft approach dangerously close to some US Navy vessels, their maneuvers are reckless and lack the sophistication of their American counterparts, who calmly prepare to counter any aggression. The US ships equipped with superior defensive systems maintain their position, forcing the Chinese to reconsider their approach. The US Navy responds by scrambling FA-18 Super Hornets in addition to the ones routinely patrolling. Unfortunately, as has been the case in the past, the aircraft come dangerously close to one another and again a collision occurs. One of the Chinese pilots loses his nerve after this and launches a missile, fearing he will also be impacted. From that moment, the 2 flights engage each other in air-to-air combat. Things escalate further. One of the Chinese ships gets involved and launches a salvo of HQ-16A surface-to-air missiles at the Super Hornets in flight. These missiles have an operational range of 40 kilometers and a speed of Mach 3. They're not as capable as the US Navy's RIM-162S missiles, which can hit targets 50 kilometers away at a speed of Mach 4, but they add to the confusion and take some of the Super Hornets by surprise, destroying one of them and forcing others to retreat, with more enemy aircraft coming. The Super Hornets, momentarily focused on air-to-air engagements, strategically avoid the Chinese ships, knowing that reinforcements armed with ship-destroying capabilities are already en route. The US Navy's ability to adapt rapidly ensures that any surface threat will be neutralized efficiently once the appropriate assets arrive. The US Navy now has an objective forced on it. It must destroy the PLAN aircraft carrier before casualties balloon. Diplomats in Washington and Beijing have almost certainly reached out to one another by now to try and defuse the situation, but the carrier group's commander cannot expect that to happen in a fast enough time. Protecting the Navy's sailors has to be the top priority. Fortunately, the American carrier would have been ready for this, given all of the tensions in the area. More Hornets would have been on standby and equipped with RGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles. 2 squadrons of these would be ready to go. Another squadron of Hornets would be on alert and ready to be armed with anti-air or anti-ship missiles within an hour. The Hornets would now engage the lead Chinese ships with their Harpoon missiles. These missiles skim close to the waterline at subsonic speed. Some of them would be countered by the Chinese ship SAMs, but the flight of Hornets would have launched too many Harpoons, and just a few hits at a ship's waterline would be enough. At least one of the forward-deployed Chinese ships would go down. Meanwhile, the remaining J-15s would be engaged and either shot down or forced to retreat by the Super Hornets that now significantly outnumber them. The squadron will fly north toward the Chinese carrier. China scrambles a large squadron of its planes, including J-15s and land-based aircraft like the J-11 and J-16, in an attempt to counter the superior US aircraft. These planes are armed with the PL-15 missile, which, while boasting a long range and high speed, lacks the battlefield versatility of the US's well-tested AMRAAM. Although the AIM-260 JATM is not yet widespread, the American pilot's superior tactics and the US Navy's advanced electronic warfare systems negate much of the PL-15's potential advantage, turning what China hoped would be a strength into a mere parity at best. As soon as they detect the Super Hornets, they open fire. The American pilots are now in a bind. Logic would indicate that they would need to take evasive maneuvers immediately. However, these are all highly trained naval aviators. They know that they need to give their missiles the highest kinetic energy possible in order to maximize their effectiveness, so they would likely move as close as they could, fire their own missiles, and then take those evasive maneuvers. The PL-15 missiles have weaknesses, which are quickly exploited by the experienced American pilots. The long-range shot causes the missiles to lose significant energy, which, combined with the US pilots' tactical maneuvers, render the PL-15s ineffective. The Super Hornets' advanced countermeasures and the thicker air at low altitude further degrade the missile's performance. As a result, the American aircraft suffer minimal damage, while the poorly coordinated Chinese forces face significant losses in the ensuing engagement. Many of the Chinese aircraft will be armed with the PL-12. This missile entered service in 2005, but was developed at a time when China was still a military backwater. This missile only has a range between 70 and 100 kilometers. Super Hornets armed with AMRAAMs would outshoot these missiles, and it's unlikely that any of them would be destroyed in return. The Super Hornets also have an advantage in their radars. Many of the Chinese aircraft would likely not know they're being targeted until the AMRAAM's radar activates near the end of the projectile's flight path to their targets. However, an initial confrontation like this would not result in the loss of the Chinese aircraft carrier. There wouldn't be enough momentum to get to it. As the initial battle goes on, Chinese fighter aircraft will be launched from Hainan Island to reinforce their comrades. H-6 bombers would also take off to provide additional firepower in an effort to destroy the American carrier. Unfortunately for the US Navy, this will be a vulnerable point, as many of the Super Hornets would have shot their payloads at this point and would need to return to the carrier to rearm. However, a few would remain circling around the disputed airspace to provide a forward presence. As the previous aircraft returned to rearm, the remaining Super Hornets on the carrier would be armed and ready to go by now. Each one will be equipped with at least 9 air-to-air missiles, but they need to take off before the Chinese aircraft get too close. E-2D Hawkeye AWACS aircraft in the area would have given the carrier's captain warning that a large number of enemy planes were on their way, redoubling the urgency of rearming and relaunching the Super Hornets. These would get into the sky and move as far away from the American carrier as possible to keep the Chinese aircraft at bay. Unfortunately, the Hawkeye is soon destroyed by Chinese missiles, so the American aircraft would need to rely on other sources of information. The squadrons from the American carrier versus the Chinese land and sea-based aircraft would now become the largest air battle of modern times, and the missiles flying through the sky would easily be a volley unlike anything seen in history. Fortunately, even without the Hawkeye, the American aircraft will be well informed. The FA-18 comes with an AN/APG-79 radar. This is an AESA radar that allows a track and scan ability to lock on and fire at multiple targets with ease. The Chinese aircraft will be at a disadvantage with their radars. China is a relative newcomer with advanced radars, and many of their older planes like the J-11 would be in the sky in this fight. Not all of them would be armed with the PL-15 either, but rather the obsolescent PL-12. The result is that many more of the Chinese planes will become casualties than their American counterparts. However, after this engagement, the Super Hornets would be out of missiles and again be forced to return to the carrier. The carrier is now even more vulnerable than the first such instance because there will be few, if any, American aircraft in the vicinity to stop the Chinese planes. The tyranny of distance has now entered the arena in a big way. China has the advantage of fighting close to its homeland. Its supply lines are therefore shorter, and it can bring more assets to the fight on a moment's notice. In contrast, the United States can only fight with what it has on hand at the moment. It needs to ship supplies and reinforcements over thousands of miles. The remaining aircraft from the Chinese mainland would still be large in number, more easily replacing losses. Each American aircraft loss is temporarily irreplaceable. The Chinese ships would also soon come into range. These would now launch their YJ-18 cruise missiles. These projectiles have a range of up to 540 kilometers and are normally subsonic in velocity, but there is a catch. In the final approach phase, a solid rocket booster brings their speed up to Mach 3. They fly near the waterline, making them hard to shoot down and more destructive when they hit their targets. The Chinese bombers from the mainland would launch their own anti-ship cruise missiles, and the YJ-83K in conjunction with the ship-launched YJ-18s. These are slower, remaining at subsonic velocity, and come armed with a 190-kilogram high-explosive warhead. The two types of anti-ship missile would complement each other though. The American carrier's escort ships would first fire their SM-6 surface-to-air missiles to intercept the incoming Chinese projectiles. These missiles have a range of 370 kilometers, making them ideal for destroying projectiles at long range. Several volleys of these missiles will be launched at the Chinese missiles and aircraft, with a high rate of successful interceptions. However, these missiles would eventually be depleted in the face of such a huge Chinese volley, and the carrier escorts would need to resort to other measures. Shorter-range RIM-162 SM missiles would move into action. These have an estimated operational range of 50 kilometers and a speed of Mach 4. However, there would be other problems, because these are not the only projectiles the American carrier group would need to deal with. DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles will be launched from Hainan. These missiles have a range of 2,150 kilometers and a 600-kilogram high-explosive warhead with a speed of Mach 10. These are difficult to intercept, but the escort ships also have SM-2 missiles as part of the Aegis weapon system aboard Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. These interceptors have a ceiling of 24.4 kilometers, a range of 185, and a speed of Mach 3.5. This hail of interceptors would have a high success rate in countering most of the Chinese cruise missiles. However, some would impact, and more ballistic missiles would. Some of the American ships would go down, as there are simply too many missiles. There is likely no avoiding this scenario. However, while China has the tyranny of distance on its side, it also has a big disadvantage. China's surface ships consist mainly of smaller vessels like frigates and corvettes. This is why it remains significantly behind the US Navy in terms of tonnage. The Chinese ships would not be as survivable, and Super Hornets armed with harpoons would engage and destroy several of the Chinese carriers' escorts. To make matters worse for China, the United States has a Seawolf-class nuclear attack submarine in the area that now swings into action. America's nuclear subs are not so easy to destroy with missiles, and they are much quieter than the Chinese subs. The American submarine gets into position and launches its Mark 48 guided torpedoes against more of the Chinese escort ships, and its harpoon missiles at the Chinese carrier. Escort ships detect and intercept these, but there's more to come. Meanwhile, the Chinese missiles impact the American ships, damaging the American carrier. However, Super Hornets are now in the sky along with another weapon, the F-35B. While the Hornets engage the Chinese escort ships, the F-35Bs are armed with AGM-158 long-range anti-ship missile, LRASM. The LRASM likely has a range of 370 kilometers, and to make matters better, it's difficult for radar to detect. Although China has come a long way in aviation and radar, it's still significantly behind the United States in stealth technology and countermeasures. While the Hornets engage the Chinese missiles and fighters, the F-35s move in. They choose to not use the missiles at their longest range, instead preferring to evade detection until the last moment to give their projectiles as much energy as they can when striking their target and to give the enemy less time to respond. The F-35s launch their missiles at a range of 60 kilometers and speed away. The Chinese carrier's crew, already rattled from the harpoon attack, does not know that this was only the first salvo coming at it. The carriers detect the F-35s when they attack, but the missiles remain stealthy. The LRASM is also guided by artificial intelligence to plan its own attack, if need be, and break through enemy electronic warfare countermeasures. The LRASMs impact the Chinese carrier with their 450-kilogram warheads and strike the target near the waterline. The Chinese sailors have no choice but to abandon ship as it sinks. The remaining Chinese aircraft are running low on fuel and have to return to Hainan. Meanwhile, the Super Hornets and F-35s have no carrier to return to either, so they decide to make a break for Filipino territory. A few of the F-35s were shot down after they were detected launching their LRASMs. By the end of an engagement like this, thousands of sailors and aviators would be dead or wounded on both sides. Diplomats in Washington and Beijing would be scrambling to try to prevent this battle from becoming a wider regional war, but with the loss of so many thousands and billions of dollars worth of equipment, finding a way for both countries to save face would be difficult. This scenario shows that for all its advancements, China's military still cannot match the United States in a direct confrontation. In a scenario involving an aircraft carrier battle, China's lack of stealth and radars that can match the United States would likely play out in a big way. China's escort ships would also be more sinkable and carry fewer weapons than their American counterparts because they are significantly lighter. However, the cost of defeating a Chinese force is a lot higher than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20. Its home field advantage and arsenal of land and ship-based ballistic and cruise missiles have made naval operations in the area much more dangerous. In this scenario, the Chinese carrier is sunk, as are many other ships in the PLAN, but at the cost of many American ships and planes too, including a heavily damaged carrier that the US Navy can only hope will be salvageable. For now, the United States' advantage in stealth and submarine warfare should allow it to have an edge, but China has new nuclear submarines coming and more hypersonic glide vehicles coming online. The arms race in the Indo-Pacific continues. What would the environment against the Chinese carrier group look like in the 2030s? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out If US and China Go to War, Who Loses? Hour by Hour, or click this other video instead.